What's cracking, guys? Omar Isaf here, back with another video. This is a monstrous video. Sit yourself down. You're gonna enjoy this one, especially if you like a little bit of history, but more importantly, to learn something today when it comes to natural lifting, its progression, and when steroids even enter the picture when it comes to physical culture. You see, we have social media these days, we have Instagram, everyone's posting shirtless photos, but way back when, it was a lot more pure. People just got together and they did a variety of different things. They did weightlifting, they did strongman style training. Physical culture was as much an expression of strength as it was aesthetic. So I figured it makes sense to talk with the main man himself, Dr. Eric Helms, who has now done some research on this topic, the research on early anabolic use in athletes, when it actually occurred, and then how physical culture evolved over time. And this is going to be very important for everyone watching this video if you're natural and you want natural inspirations, because we've heard this before. Some people even try and discount individuals like Eugene Sandow, right? Where they're like, well, wait a second, bro, he used cocaine to get shredded. Fun fact, it doesn't work that way. I think for a lot of us, we want to try and aspire towards a certain physique, a certain goal, and we want to know that it's possible that someone else did it naturally. Not to say that we'll reach that level, but at least reach towards something. And so I think it's important to be motivated. It's important to be inspired by certain things. And this video will shed some light on how many of these lifters were truly impressive in their time. We answer a whole lot of questions, even talking about testosterone levels back then. So you're going to learn a whole lot. You're going to learn a lot about lifting. You'll learn even more importantly about yourself. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this talk, I haven't seen anything out there on this topic, this thoroughly researched with actual evidence. Make sure to like the damn video. This video will be all about the early history of anabolic steroids. Well, guys, we are back here with another video. Thanks to technology, I'm joined once again by the now legendary Eric Helms. You like Spinal Tap, England's now legendary Eric Helms in the house, someone that I not only look up to, you keep things real, you provide a lot of great information for natural lifters out there. You've been fighting the good fight, putting out all this information. You've been influential once again on me. You've been helping me with coaching now. And guess what, Eric? I'm right now about 6'6", 260. I don't know if you can tell. It's 6% body fat, so it's working.
I'm most impressed by the height gains that you've made on my program. How you've actually gotten taller. It's pretty good. Yeah,
it's it's self-reported, but I feel taller. Okay, and isn't it all about?
I look at the Excel spreadsheet and I see your height going up. It must be true. It's in Excel.
Who would lie about that? And I think that's a good segue to what we're talking about today. I like, by the way, just in case you guys want to know this, which I do think is important, Eric has all his diplomas. The man has a PhD. He's like, nah, that's too pretentious. Let me just lower the camera down a bit. We're just here to have a casual conversation. I think this is a really good one, though, Eric, and you've been at the forefront of this, which is talking about essentially true natural inspirations, and that kind of also intersects with the discovery of anabolics, with steroids, when people started using them, because you've been chronicling on your Instagram, which I'll link in the description, people that, as far as we know, are truly natural. And because in today's climate, maybe people might be suspicious or whatnot, people want to know what is possible to be achieved. And so you've been doing a lot of research in this field, and you've discovered some very interesting things. I think everyone, if you care about lifting, if you are natural and you want to know what's possible, you're really going to enjoy this video.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I kind of got really intrigued in this for those same reasons, and then I just started to find out that I'm a bit of a history buff. Yeah. So, like, independent from much else except for just pure curiosity, I went down the rabbit hole and have really tried to figure out, like, when did lifters specifically start using anabolic steroids. And so I've had to kind of go down the rabbit hole of chemistry, I've had to go down the rabbit hole of history, even some papers on statistical analysis, and then reading a ton of stuff that I normally wouldn't get exposed to, which has been a lot of fun. So I just think that history is really cool.
Yeah, and that's what we want to focus on. We want to focus on maybe the history of natural lifters and then early anabolic use when it actually started happening. And I think, again, this is important for those that want to try and take a look at certain physiques and say, hey, you know what? Maybe if I train hard, if I eat right, and also, their methodology compared to what we have now would be considered outdated. Well, we know a lot more now than they did back then. It's at least something that we can, aspire to try and attain. And so I think, I've read comments, my boy, Eugene Sandow, where some people try to hate on him, Eric, who he's from like the late 1890s, early 1900s, where people are like, yeah, but he used cocaine to get shredded, bro. Like, he's not natural. I'm like, wait a second here. Eugene, cocaine? I'm like, you think that? Or what is the other one, Eric, that people accuse Eugene of using?
Oh, amphetamines. Yeah, just the... Yeah, it's always funny to me. Like, when I think, like, cokehead or meth head, I don't think, like, shredded jack dude.
No.
But I understand it. I like, not everyone can achieve a physique like Eugene Sandow. In fact, very, 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 very few of us can ever hope to achieve that. And I think when you're frustrated and that we've all been there, I think there's it's an understandable emotional reaction to figure out a way that it couldn't be possible or real, or it's cheating in some way. I think that's, honestly, it's just good self-awareness when that happens. Like, if you're struggling to find some way that some guy in the 1890s with the knowledge, the training, lack of training equipment available, lack of, the fucking Great Depression was going on in some of these lifters' time. And if you're pretending like they had some kind of unfair advantage to you now in 2018, like, that's a pretty good indication. You can check your own biases and go, all right, I'm probably being unreasonable. I'm probably just frustrated. Yeah, and that's good, because then you can move forward. So,
and that's what I was going to say, Eric. Talk to me then about the early history of either anabolic use or just natural lifters, because again, there's some people we've talked about before, and now I look up to. Just talk to me. So people started chronicling maybe lifting, it'd be in the 1800s, just strongman, people that would do what we consider now bodybuilding. When did that start kind of rising in popularity? 1800s?
Yeah, I would say the westernized popularity of lifting began in the 1800s with these vaudeville-style strongman shows. There weren't really gymnasiums in the way we think of a gym. There was still athletics training, but proper resistance training was a thing that was so rare it was literally considered a circus act. Yeah. So in the 1800s, that's when that became popularized. People would travel around. Eugene Sandow, while we're on the topic of the guy, he put on the first bodybuilding shows in the early 1900s in the UK, and eventually had the grand competition where he got together. And back then, bodybuilding was a lot different. It wasn't based on who could be the biggest and leanest combination and most symmetrical. It had a lot more to do with like the Greek ideal. And Sandow literally went and was measuring the proportions of statues from Grecian times, and that is what they would judge on back then in the very early 1900s. He had a sculptor with him as part of the judging panel versus other IFBB pros like it would be today. And being too big was a thing. Like, we're looking for something that's a lot more balanced and symmetrical, never sacrificing size for anything else. And just a very different kind of mentality, because bodybuilding was tied more into health and athleticism, or all kind of this big conglomerate concept known as the physical culture. And that was the predecessor to bodybuilding, where bodybuilding came a lot more focused on purely the development of muscle and muscularity.
And just as a quick aside, Eric, I wanted to ask you this. When you talk about those Grecian statues, are those people, and I'll throw up a few here for people to see where they're like, holy crap, those guys are jacked. Do you think those were idealized versions of a male, what people thought like the ultimate male would look like? Or do you think that it's possible that, once again, to have that intimate knowledge of anatomy of how biceps would look that large, that there were probably some pretty jacked dudes throughout history that then they drew inspiration from?
Yeah, if you really want to go back, you can find stuff, and especially if you get outside of kind of this Western-centric look, like there was some amazing Indian strongmen and wrestlers even earlier than the kind of the 1800s. And, obviously the Olympics is something we inherited from Greek culture. And they did a lot of like manual resistance training and things that included like wrestling. And there were probably some pretty muscular Greek dudes out there, especially once they had like a stable society with aqueducts and water and steady food supply and a public demand for athletic competitions, that there was a way to make a living off being an athlete. I mean, if you think about, you know, gladiators, Greco-Roman wrestling, all this stuff. So yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on Greek history, but I would be surprised if there weren't some pretty muscular dudes running around in sandals back in the day.
Well, I was going to say, it's like everyone thought, it's like, oh, cool, we're going to learn about, you know, the early history of bodybuilding and then anabolic use. Nope, you're getting a lesson in civilization where you're like, they built aqueducts and then that is stable society. Okay, so we're now talking 1890s, guys like Eugene Sandow. He gets some attention. We're outside of that small niche of people that did do this lifting, this physical culture. You know, people are starting to see his physique, admire it, as we understand it. What happened from there then? So we go from the late, you know, 1890s to the early 1900s. More people start doing it. We start seeing more physiques.
Yeah, so cool thing, if you look at the history of quote-unquote Olympic weightlifting, it actually started out as one of the events in track and field. And then it would evolve to eventually becoming its own sport later in the early 1900s. And the events changed a lot over time. So it started out with, they would, a little kind of like CrossFit, there would be different barbell and dumbbell events in Olympic weightlifting that were all kind of dynamic full body movements. So they would have like single arm dumbbell snatches, and Olympic weightlifting evolved through the 30s and eventually became its own thing with a 3-lift, snatch, clean and jerk, and then clean and press at that point. But yeah, so that's really where most of weightlifting was, and most of bodybuilding was. It was totally entwined with Olympic weightlifting. Powerlifting wasn't yet a thing. You know, benches and squat racks that could support the kind of weight that people can physically squat and physically bench press didn't come around until a few decades later, at least in regular use. And people were using all kinds of cool implements. Like there was a thing called strand pulling, also known as like chest expanders, where people are pulling apart cables. Look like basically really, really firm slinkies that you'd pull apart. And the early cable machines were developed by some people. There's some amazing physiques that are out there from people who are using calisthenics, gymnastics, weightlifting, and strand pulling and dumbbells. A combination of all that, and you'd see some pretty awesome stuff, which shouldn't surprise anyone when you look at the upper body of gymnasts today. Yeah. Just to know how much you can do with that style of training. And yeah, people were doing a mixture of very heavy kind of single maximal effort dynamic barbell movements, and then getting a decent amount of volume through things like dumbbell work, body weight work, and sometimes strand pulling and other things like that.
Now, in our traditional definition of bodybuilding, how did that emerge from all of this physical culture? So we're going from early 1900s now to maybe the 10s, the 20s. What started happening? Because, as you said, there was a much greater confluence between different lifting styles, where people might, you know, you do a little bit of gymnastics, you might do a little bit of strongman training, barbell implements. What happened then from there? How did it evolve where we start seeing some of these physiques that are not only impressive, but people are focusing more on the aesthetic component and maybe a little bit less on the, you know, the feats of strength?
Right. Yeah. So Sandow and a few others were some of the first who their vaudeville acts would not just be lifting, but would also include muscular displays. And there's a few people around the globe who really became popular for just having an amazing muscular body. And like I said, that the first bodybuilding competitions in the UK, where that eventually got transported over to the U.S. There was a gentleman named Bernard McFadden who kind of started it over here and started the first competitions in the States, which would eventually become the Mr. America competitions. And that started in '39, but there were earlier bodybuilding competitions prior to Mr. America. They were often held in conjunction, as was the Mr. America competition for a while, with weightlifting. So you would both display your strength and display your muscularity. So they started almost the exact same thing, and then it wasn't until, I would argue, the Weeders came around. I'm kind of jumping ahead here, where they started to promote the idea of bodybuilding in its pure form, and let's remove it. Let's not do it the day after or the day of senior nationals for weightlifting. Let's have it be its own thing, at least in the United States. But yeah, there was this growing appreciation for the physical form that started in the early it started way prior to that, obviously, but as far as creating a sport out of it, started in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, in the States at least, in North America, for sure.
And so when people now are paying more attention to lifting culture, maybe more people are getting involved, it's less of a niche. At the same time, people always tend to try and find any sort of advantage. I mean, you hear of times past when it comes to ancient Rome, where if you want to increase your testosterone, what do? Eat bull testicles. What type of? Yeah, I mean, it's the only way. It's the only way to do it. Raw, especially. You can't cook that. It ruins the juices. True story. So, what are some of the things that some of these lifters try to do to help them with their performance? Like, what was the start of that sort of trend?
Yeah. Athletes are well. As soon as you start competing, that's when people are willing to take. The psychology gets behind it, and you're going to do whatever it takes within the confines, hopefully, of the rules. Not always, as we know. But yeah, so this is a hilarious history. Athletes, they do anything and everything, both that is effective and not. Like even today when you watch the Olympics, you'll see people with kinesio tape, you'll see people with cupping things on them, and a lot of stuff throughout history that when athletes take supplements, even take drugs and get therapies that sometimes aren't even not helpful, but it can be potentially harmful. But they also do things that do work. So the history of what I would say would be the progenitor to anabolic steroid use was, like you said, the consumption of animal testicles and animal sex parts, right? Because there was this understanding, like we just saw in nature and in ourselves, that men tended to be more muscular than women on average, and that that maybe that male power is derived in the difference between the sexes. So consumption of animal testicles, and then crazily enough, in the early 1920s all the way through the late 1890s, that kind of time frame, there were actual experiments where they would try to implant animal or human testicles into other people, or organotherapy. Most of the time, and we're talking like 90% plus, this would result in infection and potential serious problems.
That is disgusting. I did not even know that. In your effort to find the truth, Eric, you've uncovered so many things. You're like, I know too much now, bro. I just know too much.
Yeah.
And Eric, just for the record, we know that does not work, right? Either consuming animal sex parts or anything of that nature, or getting bull testicles attached to your body. Like, what are we talking about here? Yeah. So just disturbing rabbit hole I went down learning all this stuff of doctors self-experimenting with implanting organs, and also people just in general, much more normal, is doing various things with trying to eat animal parts or the sperm or semen from, or just the whole testicle. And we know from modern medicine, and even not so modern medicine, to be honest, this isn't like new information, that wouldn't work for enhancing testosterone levels. Or, I mean, if you think about it, like every sex worker who's out there would be probably pretty jacked. Like if you think about it logically, we would have your favorite porn stars would be just like, jacked biceps, if somehow consuming some of these things, fluids or parts or whatnot, increase your testosterone levels or hormones.
Correct. Yeah, and it's simply just not the same thing. Like sperm is not testosterone. Right. But yeah, and then implanting an actual animal organ, we know, hell, like you get tissue rejection if you implant something that is not your own. So like that's a different species entirely. So yeah, obviously 90% of the time when that was done, it resulted in infection and potential like serious medical complications. And there's no record of athletes even doing that anyway. That was always kind of a medical thing. But for a very long time, until well after testosterone was actually developed and could be injected and taken, testosterone was viewed as a virility drug and a health thing. It was seen as it makes you healthy and virile, and it wasn't really seen as a performance-enhancing drug or possible performance-enhancing hormone until maybe the 40s or 50s, even though it was developed in the mid-30s.
Wow. Okay, so let's back up for a second because I've followed your series on Instagram in terms of when testosterone was first produced and first made. And someone said a comment that made me laugh. Where they said, "Wait a second, it was first being theorized in the 1890s," and you're like, "That doesn't mean that then it was immediately produced, distributed, and everyone had access to it." So can you break down then where that whole stream of thought came from to synthesize or make testosterone, and when it first started, who was first thinking of it, and then just that whole process to creating testosterone? And also, Eric, can you just explain why people would want that in the first place? Like, what would extra testosterone do that we now know?
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of clinical, and that was the vast majority of the research was clinical uses for testosterone. In hypogonadal men, people who don't have a appropriate production of normal testosterone. That's something where there is a very valid and helpful use for testosterone. So in the, I'd say 1920s, the clinical potential applications of testosterone became pretty apparent, and there was this race to try to isolate and synthetically produce testosterone so it could be used in a medical setting. But yeah, that's a great comment you mentioned about there's a big difference between a drug being produced and then actually going to market and then people having access to it. And the timelines, even in modern times, are pretty large. As an example, people are all talking about SARMs now in 2018. And to my knowledge, they were only available about 5-6 years ago. So when they first started hitting, mainstream market, and maybe some people had early access, but we're talking maybe 2010, or something like that, if I had to guess. But they were first, I think, produced, theorized, and checked out in like 99. So now, even in modern times, there's like a 15-year lag. And that's with Google Translate, the internet, transatlantic phone calls, transatlantic flights, almost everything being published in English in terms of in terms of science. And none of that existed at this time. So if you look at the actual timeline, especially considering World War II happened, which really interfered with this process, the creation of testosterone and the implementation and how long it took to go to market was actually remarkably fast. But it wasn't immediate. Yeah. And you hear claims online like, 1936 Olympics and onward, everyone was on gear. And that to me is it's just, it's so preposterous, it's funny to me, Yeah. Because of just understanding the actual history. So in the early 1930s, there were actually 3 separate labs that were racing to produce and isolate testosterone in Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. So there was a lot of kind of this gestalt.
Wait, Eric. It wasn't first made in America?
Unfortunately, it was not made in America.
So it's some sort of foreign country.
Foreign powers.
Wow.
Foreign powers.
This is now the real. I got to put on my Alex Jones tinfoil hat here. We're about to get in conspiracy. So these 3 countries. Go on. Sorry.
That's right. So Switzerland, Germany, and Netherlands. There were labs in each one of them trying to produce it in the early 1930s. And I think the first androgenic, it's a male hormone that was produced, was, I believe, androsterone. And it's hilarious what they had to do this shit back in the day. It was so logistically problematic. They had to get 15,000 liters of urine from Berlin policemen to then chemically cook that down to get a very small amount. We're talking to run a trial of androsterone.
So they got it from 15,000 liters of urine.
Urine from young policemen in Berlin. Yep, this is all documented. That's amazing.
Yeah. Wow.
And it kind of stays in that vein for a long time. So in 1935, all of this research culminated in the actual isolation and production of testosterone. The problem is that testosterone in its just pure form has a half-life of 10 minutes. So that means it's in and out. It's not effective for treatment or performance or anything, really. It's gone. So if you were to inject it or take it without modifying it chemically somehow, it doesn't really work because it's gone. So in 1936, they produced methyltestosterone as an oral tablet, and they also produced what's called testosterone propionate, which is an injectable with a 19-hour half-life, which is still really problematic. That means you've got to do daily injections. And also the oral methyl testosterone was very quickly found to be liver toxic. And it fell out of favor in the medical community because it was causing all kinds of problems, and it was causing way more harm than it was causing help. So the way they got around this was they were injecting tablets, subdermal tablets in the skin that would slowly dissolve into the bloodstream of testosterone to get a more consistent half-life. So yeah, being a hypogonadal man in the 30s and 40s kind of sucked, because you're either dealing with hepatotoxic pills that you had to take, daily injections, or getting subdermal implants. And it was incredibly expensive, to the point where, like I said, just like it took 15,000 liters of urine to get intersterone, and for a decade, the only way they could produce this stuff was by getting animal testicles. Right. So again, not eating it though, but they would have to actually go through a process of breaking it down to synthesize testosterone from that. And it took 100 kilograms, that's 220 pounds of bull testicles. So we're talking thousands of testicles, right? Because each one is weighing...
Picture, guys.
Yeah, we're good. Like a wheelbarrow of bull testicles to produce 10 milligrams of testosterone.
Insane. And that's so when we talk about another barrier to entry, because we're trying to discover which of these physiques early on were truly natural. Early 1890s, as more people started doing it, I would argue, well, Eugene Sandow had a fantastic physique. There's physiques in the 1900s, 1920s, and so forth, where they even got better, and we can now be pretty damn confident. And when I say pretty damn confident, I mean like 99 point whatever percent that they were.
Man, I'd say 100% at this
100%,
stage.
yeah.
It's just not possible. Yeah. So exactly right, though. As the physical culture became more popularized and actual competition started coming around, and some of these guys would open gyms, like Sigmund Klein opened a gym in New York, and there became an actual way for people to train and follow and become part of this extremely niche culture, but still it existed. It went from being a niche culture from being a circus act. So now you've actually just got a larger population in the world and a greater penetration of the popular culture of people actually lifting weights. So it's just a numbers game. You're going to find someone with a better genetic profile who's lifting weights, and it's going to look better than the previous generation. But yeah, so the reason why I said 100% is because you would literally need you would need like an entire field of bulls you'd have to be constantly castrating animals on a regular basis to run a steroid cycle. And it would cost you, we're talking millions of dollars in a time when...
Eric, come on. These lifters had millions of dollars because they're that dedicated. Why are you denying the plausibility of this?
So yeah, for what it would have required in this era for someone to run a steroid cycle would be the willingness to potentially shut down their liver, do daily injections, or have an implanted pellet on a regular basis. But more importantly than that, to have a steady supply of thousands of bull testicles and
the money.
Yeah, the money to have that, and greater pharmaceutical knowledge than anyone else on the planet had at the time.
Right.
And an understanding that they were actually a performance-enhancing drug, which no one believed or even thought of at the time.
Right.
And a manufacturing plant to do all of this, because this was all done on a very small scale, just to run, pharmaceutical trials and in hospitals. So you need to have basically the resources of the top-level hospitals in the day on an individual basis when you're some niche culture random guy in New York who's just enjoying the health benefits of lifting weights,
And I mean, come on, we know Eric bodybuilders, they're all poor as shit. Like, they're all focusing on their craft. I'm like, you don't got the money for this. And that's what I think for some people, when they first hear, testosterone was first synthesized in 1936 or what have you, they then immediately equate it to modern times, where if you wanted to get testosterone, either you get a TRT script, or you could buy for several $100s. All the barriers to entry are so it becomes impossible. A question I have for you, Eric, when you said it first was used for individuals for health reasons, when did it even become, something in people's minds to test it when it comes to athletes or performance? Like, how did it go from pure health then to some people thinking it might benefit performance? Like, when did that start happening?
Yeah, so there was isolated instances. There was I think in 1938, someone wrote into Strength and Health magazine and said, hey, do you think testosterone might be helpful for building a muscular body? And that was the only instance you'll find until like 15, 20 years later. And then you start to see ads Well, I'll get before that. So there was a book in 1945 called The Male Hormone by Paul de Kruif. And there's literally only one line in the whole book about this, where he speculates that, hey, wouldn't it be cool if baseball teams would start to inject testosterone, and it might give them a performance boost like vitamins. So they're kind of still looking at it like vitamins, you know, so it's still kind of this health mentality. And that's really the only mention. And you don't see anything about testosterone in bodybuilding magazines until like after the 50s. You know, it's not really a part of the culture or the mindset. And that's also when the readily available, easy to use, orally safe synthetic testosterone derivatives came out, and came out. Nilevar in 1956, Dianabol in 1958. Those are when everything kind of changed. And then the first time there was a report of a high school football player taking steroids was in 1960.
Wow.
So that's really when big time cultural shift happened. 1960s onward, you probably have to be pretty skeptical about any physique you see. But to dial it back to where we were, kind of in the late 30s, early 40s, those barriers to entry really didn't start getting dropped until the late 1945, early 1946. So there's the rumors that and which are completely unsubstantiated, that like German soldiers were using testosterone in World War II. That's never been substantiated. It's just one of those things people repeat culturally. But actually the war really put a stopper on all of this pharmaceutical research, as people had to flee the country and go to other places. And like some of these researchers would have been killed by Nazi Germany, and they had to go to South America. And that's kind of how the Mexican steroid industry started. So there was a chemist named Russell Marker, and I think Russell was his first name, I might be getting that wrong, but it's called the Marker Degradation. He created in 1940 this process where by using Mexican yams, they could make testosterone at a much lower cost that allowed the actual scalability of commercial industry of testosterone. And then that got implemented, and they actually created the manufacturing plants to do this in Mexico in late 1945, and they extended that to testosterone. So basically from 1946 onward, now they could produce at scale testosterone, propionate, methyl testosterone, all these things. However, there was still the problem that it required either a pellet or a daily injection. And that's why it never really penetrated the lifting market. So the lifting community or the athletic community. So then you kind of have this period from like 1946 until the very first reports came out in the early 1950s, where we're pretty damn sure no one used them, because nowhere is there any incidence, report, discussion, or evidence that anyone was using it. But it's like theoretically possible that if someone had like a Mexican drug connect, they could have been doing it. But people also hear that, they think, oh, a Mexican drug connect, oh, there must have been this shady black market industry. There wasn't yet. Yeah. No, like people forget that black markets pop up after there is a legal market and then a gray market, and then when there's legal barriers. Once there's a legal barrier, that's when a black market pops up. And nothing was illegal at this point. It wasn't necessarily FDA approved, but it was just kind of a non-entity at this stage. So there's essentially 3 lines of separate evidence that you can use to figure out when did lifters actually first start using testosterone. So there is statistical analyses, when they actually looked at where was there an abnormal jump in the performance in weightlifting. There is the actual records of FDA approval and patent filing for long-term esters of testosterone, that lasted longer than test propionate. And then there's also the actual historical records of when lifters actually talked about when they first saw them happening, when they were first exposed to them. And they all converge, and this is why I think this is almost definitely the time point really happened, because they're separate lines of evidence at the same point, right around 1951-52 in Europe, and right around 1953-54 in the United States. So I'll go through each one of those first. The statistical analysis found that sometime between 52 to 56, the Russian weightlifting team had this really big jump in performance. And you didn't see anything like that in the rest of the world until the 60s, which kind of makes sense. In direct agreement with that, there is historical records of the U.S. Team doctor suspecting the Russians were using it at the 1952 Olympics. And then in talking to the Russian team at the 1954 World Championships, the doctor for the Russian team confirms, yeah, we used it in 52. And then if you look at the patent filing, testosterone enanthate, which is the first truly long-term ester of testosterone, was filed for patent in 1951 in Germany. So that means that probably right around 1950, 1951, that was when there was access to this, and that's probably when the Russians and maybe some other Eastern Europeans started using anabolic steroids, because they had actually usable performance-enhancing injections that didn't have to be done every single day. Then in the States, once that knowledge was found out, the doctor goes back and he starts hooking up the same thing going on at York Barbell in the East Coast. And the first records of anyone experimenting with this is basically retired lifters. So we're talking like John Grimmick and a few of the other Mr. Americas from the early 50s and late 40s. Kind of after their careers sort of over, they started experimenting with this stuff. Because Grimmick was the man in like 40 and 41, and in the mid 40s. So he's not competing anymore. He's not lifting, and he's still lifting, but just for his own personal desire. The first records were in 1954. Some of these guys tried it out and wanted to use it. And now all the reports are that it didn't work very well. They got a lot of side effects, and there was this big lag of experimentation to widespread use until Nilevar and Dianabol came out, because they were much more built for having low side effects but a large level of anabolic effects. So essentially, we've got all of this data converging on that same point. So if you see a physique, an American physique, or probably like a physique from the UK, just in the Western world, from 1953 and earlier, I would say you've got a damn near 100, I'd say like a 99% chance that they are drug-free. And if you see it before 1945 or earlier, it's definitely like 100%. It's impossible. You would have to fight such a steep uphill logical battle that it's like, why would you make that argument?
I got one word for you, bro. 2 words for you to counter everything.
Time travel.
Bruce Wayne. You said these millions of dollars. Gotcha.
That's true. The original Batman was on gear. Yes. 100%. Yep.
But besides him, Eric,
no one else. So besides Batman using it since 1936, because he brought his own cow farm and manufacturing plant, and did have a PhD in chemistry because he's Batman.
He's Batman.
He's Batman.
Yeah.
I think everyone was drug-free from except the people in the clinical trials, and they're not really, they're hypogonadal, so they're not really, they weren't natty to come into it. Yeah, they were anti-natty. Yeah. So
the opposite. I was going to say, Eric, what to me is so inspirational about finding this out is that for a long time, because there was conflicting reports, not people that are actually studying this. So you're applying science, evidence, taking a look at the research, being meticulous, presenting something after you've done quite a bit of searching in order to find the truth. Before that, there's just people kind of, it's the internet, talking out their ass, saying certain things. And so the public as a whole didn't know, and I think that's why this is a really good, something positive for the community to know this. We see so many lifters post Eugene Sandow, because people then will try and use that argument that Eugene said, well, he was an anomaly, right? Like we can know, unless people believe that meth somehow makes you jacked, we know for sure that Eugene Sandow was jacked. But he's an anomaly, bro. Like he's a 1 in, like 1 in a billion chance. But then we see, once we know that, it's like pretty much before 1946, it's literally impossible for a lifter to be using anabolic steroids. We have such a huge catalog of lifters that have impressive, not only physiques, but also impressive feats of strength that we now know. I'm not saying that an individual watching it's like, damn, I could have that exact same physique or that exact same, level of strength, but at least you know what is theoretically possible naturally, and that should serve as some sort of inspiration of those out there, and I think that's very cool.
Yeah, I'm gonna both agree with you, and I'm gonna disagree with you just a little bit, because I think like one thing I get on my Instagram a lot as well is like, man, what were the lifters doing right back in the day? And I think you have to remember that there's such a thing as selection bias. If the only people who are going to be remembered are the people with the most impressive physiques, the most impressive lifts, and I think it is really cool to be inspired and just impressed by what the human body is capable when it's expressed in a great genetic variant and someone works hard for a lifetime. But I think it's also it's unlikely that the average person is going to develop a physique like that. And I'm not saying, and it's the same problem with comparing yourself to anyone on Instagram, whether it's a picture of Eugene Sandow from over 100 years ago, or whether it's your favorite bodybuilder. I think we really have to stick with appreciating how far we've come from where we started, even if it may not be objectively, externally impressive compared to what someone really else has developed. So I think it's really important to have an appreciation for these physiques, for the marvels they were, rather than making it all about you. Because the reality is you're probably not going to be John Grimmick. That's why they literally instituted a rule that you can only win Mr. America once. Because when he won in 1940 and then he won in 1941, they were like, you can only win it once. Because this is a dude who had on stage, he wasn't as lean as they are today, but he had a fat-free mass index in 1941 that was like 30.
Yeah.
Like, that's pretty rare, you know?
Yeah. He was a freak of freaks.
Absolutely. And a lot of these guys were. And that's what's cool about it, you know? And I would say, if someone had the argument of, look, well, man, I'm not going to use that as some kind of goal for me, because they're the absolute genetic freak of their time, I would say, yeah, that's very fair. So I don't want to give everyone the impression that we're saying, hey, you too can be Bill Pearl or John Grimmick. Yeah.
No, absolutely, Eric. What I'd say is I feel that some people that are on the natural side, they equate being natural then sometimes with being mediocre. And I've seen even, and that's why it was great, I will reference it, but we'll talk about it briefly here, is I did an interview with James Krieger about testosterone, the effects of testosterone, and then talking also about testosterone levels over time. And once again, what some people will say, where it's like, well, yes, now we have a large pool of lifters we know that are natural. It's like, at the same time, bro, testosterone levels back then were so much higher. We were just weak, sissy boys now. If we can only achieve what they had. And, James Krieger broke it down. It's like, even if they've only measured, I think, what in populations, was it since the 1980s, like the general population testosterone levels?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and they noticed a slight decrease over time. He said if you take into account the rise in obesity, which is definitely, that correlates then to your testosterone levels. If you take that out of the equation, people just being fatter now and thus having lower testosterone, our testosterone levels are pretty damn comparable. Not only that, but even if the people back then, hypothetically, for some reason, there's something in the air that made them just have higher testosterone, there are physiological natural limits that people would have, and so the impact upon our physiques would be minuscule at best.
Yeah, not even that. It's just if you look at the broad picture of things, if anything, and I would say this is the truth, it was much harder to develop a good physique back then. Yeah. Because of the lack of gyms, good equipment, especially when we're talking in like the 20s and 30s, the Great Depression, the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you're more likely to have a like malnutrition or deficiencies in your intake versus having this amazing environment for building muscle. I mean, life expectancy was much lower. We spent like a factor of multiple numbers more time doing chores. We had a much harder life. Yep. So the idea that some very, very small increase in testosterone would overcome all that and make it so that everyone was Superman back in the day it's just kind of really ignoring the broader historical perspective.
And Eric, from you doing all this research now just for your own, you're like, oh, I find this history interesting. Is there any other takeaway points you've learned for yourself? Things that you thought, oh shit, or things maybe for people to keep in mind when they now hear this video and they think to themselves, all right, I guess I got to put work in at the gym. Like, I guess, is that what I got to do? Really? Oh shit, all right.
I think one of the coolest takeaways is just that just because there's a way something is done today doesn't mean it's the only way it can be done. The entire bodybuilding mindset in the early 1900s and late 1800s, I found just really, really interesting. How it was intertwined with health, it was intertwined with performance, and it was very, very holistic. And the idea of making a sacrifice of taking something that would potentially harm your health to be better was incongruous at a certain point in bodybuilding, even though now it is just an absolute part of the culture. And I'm not hating on the current culture. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just very interesting to see how cultures change over time. And also, that's one cool takeaway. The second cool takeaway is there are just so many people who have been who've done amazing things in the history of physical culture who we don't remember today. And I think that's one thing that I hope to get out there, just sharing that information. Just people who have done amazing feats of strength and had amazing physiques that we have, not all of us, but a large mainstream group of us have forgotten about. And it's just cool to find so many different instances of inspiration and unique stories, and just the personal lives of these people I think is very interesting.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is one of my favorite takeaways from all this is when you talk about physical culture, how there kind of was that integration. That's kind of what you guys try and do with 3DMJ, where people, you know, they're lifting for strength, they're lifting for performance, and then also they're lifting then for aesthetics. They want to look a certain way. And even as you mentioned that, where you do a competition, so you do weightlifting, and then the next day you do essentially a bodybuilding show, right? Mm-hmm. And that just, now, as you said, these days, those two are so separated, where you do bodybuilding, or then, all right, you're going to be powerlifting, or you're going to do weightlifting. And that confluence, once again, of ideas, I find a lot more interesting.
Yeah. Today you're supposed to take a week off legs before you get on stage. Not that I recommend that, but that's not an uncommon practice. Well, back then the common thing was, well, yesterday I just had a max clean and jerk. So
today I'm stepping on stage and I'm posing, right? Exactly. And even those guys, like the guy that I really like, the American lifter, Tommy Kono, where I'm like, this guy's a badass weightlifter, and he also did bodybuilding, and that's what I think. Maybe, hopefully, a revival of that. I mean, that's a little bit what this channel is about. Appreciation, I'd say, if you say physical culture as a whole, right, and the various aspects, and how they're intertwined, I think is just very, very cool. Eric, is there anything you want to add to this entire discussion where we did this interview? People, you've heard of Netflix and chill. This is instead, learn your damn history of lifting and chill.
The only thing I would add is that while I am wearing a Rascal shirt on this channel, the one I wish I was wearing was the old school. The old school shirt. It would have been so perfect.
You know, sometimes perfection is an illusion, and it could just send you on this rabbit hole of despair. So,
this is true.
You're like, that doesn't explain anything of what I just said.
You're like, give me a date. I want the shirt, motherfucker.
You just show up on my door. I'm like, oh my god.
How did you get in my country?
You're like, don't worry about it. I was going to say, Eric, I want to thank you for doing this, though, because once again, I think this is a public service, a public good, where people then can learn a little bit about the history, because sometimes we are just in general short-sighted, where it's like, yeah, bro, look, I just want to get jacked. It's like, hey, man, you think you're jacked? It's like, let's look at some people in times past, or let's even look at their feats of strength. And so it's good to get a little bit of clarity on this subject. I'm excited, too, for those that are tuning in to the future, where there's going to be some updates. We discuss some medical things just in regards to training. So I'm very excited for the future. For you, Eric, what do you got going on for yourself? This is the time and place where you promote yourself, you pimp yourself. You're someone that puts out excellent information. Everyone should be following you, at the very least, on Instagram, which is going to be linked below. But what's next for you?
Man, I'm really excited. Myself, Andrew Valdez, and Andy Morgan have been hard at work pumping out the second edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which everyone who bought the first edition, they're just going to show up in your email pretty soon, probably end of year, beginning of next year. And we've really gone all out to update them, to have them be very comprehensive, to respond to all of the questions that people had that they didn't feel were answered in the first books. And it's just been a lot of fun writing them, so I'm just really looking forward to getting that out there.
I will say, for anyone that's actually interested in increasing their knowledge, either when it comes to nutrition or lifting, should already have the pyramids. I'll link that in the description. I'm not paid in any way to say that. It's just the honest truth, because I do think that spreading good information is incredibly important, right? Because there could be a lot of misinformation. I think it's one of those things where, in general today, because there's a lot of people producing content, but not necessarily, I don't want to say valuable content, but just content that's truthful, trying to promote good information becomes even more important. So, Eric, I think this video was badass. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the video. If you made it all the way to the end, you're like, damn, we went through a journey together, half an hour journey, but like anything else, it has to end. Make sure to like the video, and if you do want to learn more about the history, one will have resources in the description. But comment below if this sparked some sort of interest for you guys, where you just want to learn more information. Leave a comment below. And with that being said, I want to thank everyone for watching the video. I'll see all you guys, my rascals, in that next one. Peace.
Peace.